Hello, good evening, and a warm welcome to The Turning Point. Our guest this evening is Dr. Sarawanamutu Dr. Parkyasuti Sarawanamutu, even, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Policy Alternatives. Thank you, Dr. Sarah, and apologies for that mistake. And thank you for coming to The Turning Point.
Thank you for inviting me.
So we constantly hear this saying or this call that we need strong government, we need stability in policy, and so on. And here we find ourselves, Sri Lanka finds itself in a very, very strong position in terms of government, certainly. Expected or unexpected, the public have given the NPP a huge majority, 159 seats. What does this big majority mean? What can it mean for Sri Lanka?
Well, certainly what we needed was stable government in order to be able to implement the programs that the NPP JVP promised on the campaign trail. Now, the issue, though, is this. As far as a functioning democracy is concerned, you need a strong government, but you also need a strong opposition. And that is where there's a huge void, if you like, in terms of who is going to be the alternative government, as it were. And the SJB and the gas cylinder, they need to get their act together and come up with a formidable force, because a huge majority like this suggests, therefore, that the real opposition to the government will come from within its ranks. Yeah. And the issue there is, how many of the 159 are hardcore JVPs, and how many of them are NPPs, who we are told are the more technocratic and less extreme and more moderate lot. So if there is going to be a rift into the future, or if there is going to be contestation and all of that, I think it will come from within the ranks of the government. And this is therefore a serious challenge to the president in terms of how he is going to manage such a huge coalition. Because remember, if things go wrong, if things go pear-shaped, as it were, there is the FSP, the Frontline Socialist Party, and the Peretugami, who have sort of JVP antecedents, if you like, who will jump on the government and say, look, you promised a difference, but at the end of the day, you've turned out to be no different. And that is why I think within the first year of this government, at most, they need to do something, demonstrate their commitment very strongly to the public of Sri Lanka on corruption. And doing that means that they don't put just, a low-level person behind bars, but they go for the big fish. And you need to be able to convict a big fish, as it were, in that first year. Now, they're talking about setting up a court, a permanent court, with 3 judges and all of that. Andrew Kumara has at various times appeared at press conferences with stacks of files and saying, I've got the evidence. The issue is as to whether that evidence will really stand up in a court of law and meet the standards of evidence that are required. If it does not, and if there is political pressure to do something, then they might be tempted to go for an extrajudicial mechanism. I'm not saying that they would, I'm saying that they might be tempted to, and that would be very dangerous.
And how big is the danger that we might end up with sort of kangaroo courts in this sort of quest to hold anybody, some big fish accountable?
That is the danger, and that must be resisted at every turn, because if they don't have the evidence to do it through the normal judicial process, the persons that they are convicting will claim victimization. And they could indeed base their future political prospects, if you like, on the notion that this government launched a witch hunt against them.
And so what about, we note that the people in the north, the former conflict areas, apart from, I think, the Mandi, They voted overwhelmingly for under Kumara Dissanayake and now for the NPP in the parliamentary polls. So, what of the national question?
Yeah, I mean, they voted in the parliamentary elections. In the presidential elections, there was somewhat of an ethnic divide in terms of the way the vote went. Now, I think the reason why they voted for the JVP NPP is because they are also concerned about anti corruption. They're also concerned about providing 3 square meals a day for their kids, accessing the public health system, and all of that. And I think it was the young people who came out and really voted in favor of that, because the Tamil parties conventionally have talked about constitutional reform and 13th Amendment and all of that. Now, what are they going to do with regard to this national question? They are making a big thing out of saying that, look, we're all Sri Lankans and we shouldn't identify ourselves by this ethnic community and that. But I think they have to do something with regard to this. I mean, they can begin by implementing the constitution of the country. And that is the 13th Amendment. That could be the starting point, and if Tamil political representation insists, they might have to enter into consultations to build on that. However, I think the sort of reference document that they might well use is the report of the Lal Vijayanaka committee that happened during the Yahapalana time. Harini Surya, the Prime Minister, was a member of that committee. So I think the argument here that the JVP will put forward is that, look, we will bring democracy down to the masses. We're not going to do it on the basis of ethnicity and all of those identities. We will make it a lot more participatory, a lot more inclusive. So don't get hung up on questions like provincial councils and whatever. And they are, I think, talking in terms of bringing in a new constitution before the end of the first term. That is before the end of President Andhra Kumar Dissanayaka's first term and the first term and the term of this parliament. So let's see. But I think, what I would like to see is that in the first 100 days, the government identifies its priorities and hits the road running as far as those priorities are concerned. And to the extent, and it is clearly the case, that they have a kind of political honeymoon, they should get through Parliament those issues which are somewhat controversial, which might attract opposition and resistance.
Talking about honeymoons, um, would you sort of draw a parallel to when the war came to an end and the sort of euphoria that was evident all over the country with this current victory for the NPP?
Well, up to a certain extent. Then it was euphoria. Now it is expectancy. X, Y, and Z, expectations that X, Y, and Z will be done to change the system of governance in government and turn the economy around. So the government has to do certain things rather than rest on its laurels and have a kind of victory parade, as it were.
When I spent the last 7 or 8 months before the presidential election visiting all over the place in Sri Lanka, the common sort of denominator, if you like, was that people complained not about availability but about affordability, and in their sort of frustration, many people expressed disgust at the level of corruption that they were being treated to through the press and social media and so on. Is there really a way that this government can really put an end to this? I mean, surely they would have to start with the public service. The public service is a big component of this whole corruption issue.
Yeah, so as I said before, they have to do something on corruption within a year and catch a big fish and put them behind bars. But of course, as we all know, the money that has gone out of this country is not going to come back in a hurry. So they have to go for people who are inside this country. And as I said, I mean, instead of going, instead of getting into a situation where they might be tempted to talk about extrajudicial mechanisms,
Yeah.
you can get them on income tax like they got alcohol. You can do a number of things like that in order to catch people. But yes, the expectation is high with regard to anti-corruption, but the expectation is also high in terms of relieving the burden of adjustment on those who have disproportionately had to bear it. So the government is talking about a whole swathe of welfare measures. Now, do they have wiggle room within the IMF framework, which they say they are going to be bound by? Do they have enough wiggle room to provide those subsidies?
That wriggle room space is fast running out. We have to
No,
start paying them.
exactly. So that's when the test is going to come. If they do not have and cannot come up with the subsidies that they promise people, then it's going to be a serious question of, look, either the JVP knew this and they said all of this on the stump in order to win votes, or they are just incompetent. They don't understand what government is about.
And
And just one other point, of
yeah,
course, is that, look, with regard to the public service, we have 1.4 million or whatever. They are not talking about reducing them. I suppose a fair number of that 1.4 million are part of their constituency. They are actually talking about increasing the salaries of the 1.4
but
million.
already from the amount of money collected in terms of personal income tax, I think something like 92 or 94% goes on paying the public sector
No,
salaries
absolutely.
and pensions.
Yeah. Pay and pension is the largest, biggest ticket item. So that has to be addressed. If you do not do that, we are going to be sunk.
We already see within days of, or within a day actually, of Parliament starting, that the Minister in charge of Food Security has sort of passed an order for 70,000 tons of rice. This is probably to do with their battle with the bigger millers. Surely, what can they do? Do we need legislation like sort of monopolies and so on?
No, I think we need to look at all of this because, as I said, the social contract is broken on a number of fronts, but you have to take on those vested interests. If you do not do that, you are allowing them to hold everyone to ransom effectively because they are getting rich and we are not getting food at the prices that we are entitled to. I mean, as far as I know, it's probably easier and cheaper to get rice from abroad than it is to get it in Sri Lanka.
Indeed.
And that's an absurd situation. When we talk about the Govi Raja and all of that, the Govi Raja is not a Govi Raja in actual fact.
And what about this constitution? How important is constitutional reform?
If you are going to rebuild or redesign a social contract, you need an overarching law within which and provides the framework within it everything else falls. So in that respect, the Constitution is fundamentally important. The other point, I think, is this, is that when you come to constitutional reform, you have to make sure that the apex of power is not so skewed that all the powers are consolidated in one particular position. And that's why fundamental is the abolition of the executive presidency. The executive presidency is, at the end of the day, also responsible for corruption. The president appoints the secretaries to ministries. The secretaries to the ministries are the chief financial and audit officers in their ministries. So where are we going if we don't change that?
And it is true, isn't it, that the president under section, I can't quite remember the section, but 42 or 52, can appoint who he deems fit to be a ministry secretary.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And he has brought people from outside, and all presidents have done that. So, I mean, that has got to go. Because, if you are a prime minister, you are every single day, minute of your life as prime minister, subject to a vote of confidence. This man is not. Look at what Gotabaya Rajapaksa did, three things. Restrict the tax base, move to organic agriculture overnight, and not heed the arguments for going to the IMF. All of those things he took on his own, and no one could say anything.
And so that it's fundamental, really.
Absolutely fundamental, in my opinion.
It's often said that when I asked the lady who's now Prime Minister as to what experience the NPP will have in running a government, she said that yes, we don't have experience in being corrupt, and so on. But how much of experience is needed, really?
Well, her response is a good political response.
Yeah.
But the simple fact about it is this, that what? We have some 151 members of parliament who are first-time MPs.
Yeah.
So, apart from some of the MPs having some experience of government in terms of the public service, they are really not tested. However, having said that, there's a first time for everything. And the NPP JVP, they don't seem to be reluctant or unwilling to go for outside expertise and influence and all of that. So I'm not too worried at the present moment that they can't cope. I would give them support in the next 3 to 4 months to see how they carry on. And then, of course, if it is very clear that they do lack the competence, but they have the political stubbornness to insist on X, Y, and Z, then we have to increase the resistance to the government, try to persuade them that they are not doing things the way they ought to.
And Dr. Sarah, can I take you to this whole business of international compliance on the part of Sri Lanka's, with the UN and so on? The UN will start knocking on our doors again. It'll be that time of the year soon. Um, what what is the likely response of this government going to be? What can they respond? They can't hide behind this business that our parliament has ratified all this business, and so what can they do?
Well, I suppose that also depends in terms of how the international community perceive it. At the present moment, there is, well, I suppose, a cautious optimism that, look, this government is trying to bring in a new political culture, we need to give them time, and all of that. So if you take, for example, Geneva, the UN Human Rights Council, they can work out a compromise. And they can sort of say, okay, you want to ensure that the Sri Lanka Accountability Project stays within the Office of the High Commissioner, and we don't necessarily oppose that. But what we do oppose is the idea of having trials with foreign judges and prosecutors and all of that. But to be perfectly frank, at the present moment, I think the foreign policy of the JVP and PP and the foreign policy perspective of theirs, apart from saying we want to be friends with everyone, has not quite been tested. And that's going to be interesting because, the Indians and the Chinese are all going to be always with us. And it's therefore the question of balance between the two.
What about the uh, the the UN, for example? They'll say, look, you have the mandate of the people, you're a solid majority, and Sri Lanka is still not complying with some of these requirements. Uh, After all, some of these assurances was given by none other than President Mahinda Rajapaksa. He said that. So ever since, we've just been sort of deviating from anything and giving all sorts of excuses.
Yes, but the UN as a body can't impose sanctions on us unless it go to the Security Council.
Yeah.
And it won't go to the Security Council, or if it does, by any chance, the Russians and the Chinese will veto. So it's a kind of moral pressure that can be brought to bear. But the UN also is going through its own problems. We don't know the attitude of the United States under Trump
Yeah.
to the UN. So the jury's out.
Indeed. And will it, with all your sort of experience with all the past presidents, we've had, this is not the first time we've had a two-thirds majority. It is the first time that a single party
Has got it.
has got a two-thirds. With all that, how long or what will sully this romance?
Well, I think the whole question of corruption
Right.
is the one. I
So
think
that is the main bit.
because look, I mean, on the campaign stump, they ran on two planks.
Yeah.
One was that for 76 years or whatever it is, those two main parties were given a chance and they screwed us up in big time. Big time they screwed us up. The other one was we are the only ones who will be serious and sincere about doing something on corruption.
But to be fair, Sri Lanka has a history of not doing much about corruption. And there are big ticket items like the bond scam. Uh, we had a semi sort of quasi judicial presidential commission, but many recommendations given there, none implemented. Many people have not been charged with that. That was one. The next one was the people who were beaten up during the Aragalaya, the people who left temple trees armed with batons and whatever it is. There has been no inquiry. We then had the same police officer who was in charge of Colombo then, named by the Supreme Court in two cases of torture. And he ended up as the Inspector General of Police, for heaven's sake. So nothing done there
Yeah,
either.
so this is the point, is that Andhra Kumara and the NPP JVP are saying we are bringing in a new political culture. We are not just talking about what we will do in government, but what we will do to change people's attitudes towards government and governance. All of the things you say, they will turn around and tell you that, look, that was the old, corrupt, decrepit elite. We are not part of that. We are truly part of the people, and we are going
But
to
if they
make a
don't
change.
do anything about it, Dr. Sarah,
Then they will face a
then they
backlash.
will face a backlash.
Absolutely. They will face a backlash, and quite frankly, that backlash could be another Aragalaya, and it will make the one that happened look like a tea party.
And finally, not because of the work that you do, but in your analysis, what hope for the people of the former conflict areas? I know they voted in large part for President AKD and his party now at the general elections. But honestly, the people of the North have lived on so many promises. Um, do you think that there might even be a teeny weeny chance of delivery?
Well, the attitude of this government is not dissimilar to the attitude of the previous government, and that is that reconciliation will come through economic development. Because the Tamil parties there had never really talked about economic development and all of that. So they will look to India to underpin the economic development that's happening. But let me give you a scenario which may work out, may not. You know, the last Indian election elected a Lok Sabha that was going to decide on delimitation in India. Now, we do know that the states outside of southern India will get more seats because they have much larger populations. The states in southern India will not get that many seats, but the states in southern India have always believed that economically they've subsidized the rest of the country. And that's possibly to continue, and India is going to be one of the fastest growing economies in the world and all of that. So, in 10 to 15 years, I'm not saying that there will be sort of demands for secession, but in southern India, there might be a demand for confederation. Confederation. The north and east of this country, particularly the north, will be drawn into that economic orbit. Does it turn its back on it? No, it will go with it. And it will prosper as a consequence. And yes, we will not do much with regard to the Office of Missing Persons and all of that. Or maybe we will, because there will be a new generation that's come into politics. But the key thing is going to be this. If the North moves into that economic orbit, what does the rest of the country do? There's a south of Sri Lanka, south of Vavuniya, say, look, we don't want to have anything to do with it because the Indians are going to gobble us up. We are going to go our own way. Or are we going to get caught up in that because that's where prosperity lies?
Or do you think that the diaspora, who we are told have a a lot of money and expertise and the necessary professionalism. Do you think that this sort of new ambience in Sri Lanka, with strong government where they voted for AKD and that all that business, do you think a significant amount of money might end up in development activities in the northeast of the continent?
Yes, I mean, look at the last two elections. The diaspora spent money, but they didn't spend money on winning candidates. They spent quite a bit of money, but not on winning candidates. I think that the diaspora, up to now, has operated in terms of getting a bigger bang for its buck, rather than thinking about the development and prosperity of the northern province. But if the culture changes and they realize that they can put money behind development projects which will give them a bigger bang for their buck, but also develop the province and their people, yes, that's entirely possible.
So the future is bright for Sri Lanka?
Well, let's put it like this. I think the future is brighter than what it was, but there are always very dark clouds over the horizon.
But Dr. Sarra will be here with his Center for Policy Alternatives.
I should damn well hope so.
Dr. Pakisoti Sarunmuthu, thank you very much for being on The Turning Point. And that's the way it was on The Turning Point. Take care. And do remember to press the subscribe button, because then we can send it to you automatically. So the idea is like it, share it, and subscribe. Take care, and as always, God bless you all.